On the morning of June 15th, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakagawa stood in the reinforced observation post overlooking Saipan's western beaches and watched the American fleet through German-made binoculars. What he saw confirmed everything he already believed. Among the landing craft disgorging Marines onto the coral sand, he spotted a different kind of vessel, larger, slower, packed not with riflemen but with bulldozers, trucks, and crates of equipment. The men who climbed down from these vessels wore the same helmets as the combat troops, but they carried tools instead of weapons. Some didn't appear to carry anything at all except surveying equipment. Nakagawa lowered his binoculars and permitted himself a thin smile. "The Americans have brought their dokata," he remarked to his aide, using the Japanese term for manual laborers, men who dug ditches and poured concrete. "They build their airfields before they've won the battle. Such arrogance." His aide, Lieutenant Endo, nodded. "Their construction troops will make excellent prisoners, Commander. They'll know how to work." The observation drew quiet laughter from the officers present. In the Imperial Japanese Army, construction was the work of conquered peoples and engineering units kept far from combat. The idea of sending laborers onto a contested beach struck them as typically American. Soft, logistically obsessed, unable to grasp that wars were won by warriors, not workers. Nakagawa had read the intelligence briefings on these American construction units. They called themselves Seabees, a phonetic play on their designation as construction battalions, or Seabees. The briefings described them as older men, many past 30, recruited from civilian trades, carpenters, electricians, equipment operators, men who had spent their lives building highways and dams, now dressed in Navy uniforms and sent to stack lumber in the Pacific. "They will not survive the first night," Nakagawa said, turning back to study the beach. "And when their builders are dead, their machines will rust on the sand. The Marines will have no airfield, no supply depot, no roads. They will wither." He began drafting his afternoon report to division headquarters, noting the presence of enemy construction assets as a secondary concern. The primary threat remained the Marine infantry. The laborers were irrelevant. What Lieutenant Commander Nakagawa didn't know, what no Japanese officer in the Pacific had yet grasped, was that these laborers had been trained to kill, that the bulldozers he dismissed as logistical equipment would become instruments of terror, that within 72 hours, one of those machines would seal 63 of his men inside a pillbox, buried alive under tons of coral and sand, their screams audible for nearly 4 minutes before silence came. The Seabees had not come to Saipan to build. They had come to bury the Emperor's finest soldiers in their own fortifications. Japanese confidence in mid-1944 rested on a doctrine forged in blood and validated across 2 years of Pacific warfare. The defensive fortification was king. Since Guadalcanal, Imperial Army engineers had perfected the art of island defense. They had learned through catastrophic losses in open combat that Japanese infantry could not survive American firepower in conventional engagements. The solution was to go underground, to dig, to build positions so deeply embedded in coral and volcanic rock that no naval bombardment could reach them, no airstrike could crack them, no infantry assault could overwhelm them without bleeding the attackers white. By the time American forces approached the Marianas, Japanese fortification doctrine had reached its apex. Colonel Yoshio Tsunetomi, chief engineer of the 31st Army, had overseen the construction of over 1,200 hardened positions across Saipan alone. His after-action report from the March 1944 inspection tour reflected absolute certainty. The American Marines possess courage and firepower. They do not possess patience. Our fortifications will transform their advantages into irrelevance. They cannot bomb what they cannot see. They cannot shoot what they cannot reach. They will break themselves against our walls. The mathematics, as Japanese planners understood them, were unassailable. A single pillbox constructed to Imperial Army specifications, reinforced concrete walls 1 meter thick, overhead cover of coconut logs and coral aggregate, interlocking fields of fire with adjacent positions, required an average of 147 direct hits from naval guns to neutralize. American doctrine allocated approximately 30 shells per identified target during pre-invasion bombardment. The shortfall was obvious. the fortifications would survive. And what naval guns failed to destroy, infantry would have to take by hand. Japanese defensive calculus held that each properly constructed pillbox, manned by a single squad with adequate ammunition, could account for 15 to 20 American casualties before being silenced. Multiply that across 1,000 positions, and the mathematics promised a bloodletting so severe that even Americans, with their bottomless resources and replaceable men, would seek negotiation rather than continue. This was not wishful thinking. This was doctrine tested at Tarawa. In November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division had assaulted Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll. The island measured less than half a square mile. The Japanese garrison numbered 4,800 men. In 76 hours of fighting, the Marines suffered over 3,300 casualties, nearly 1,000 dead. The Japanese fortifications had performed exactly as designed. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, commander of the Tarawa garrison, had transmitted a final message before his death. The Americans cannot take this island. He was wrong about the outcome, but right about the cost. And Japanese planners across the Pacific absorbed the lesson. Fortifications worked. Every position that held for an extra hour, every bunker that required a frontal assault to silence, pushed the Americans closer to a negotiated peace. What Japanese doctrine could not account for, what no defensive manual had ever considered, was an enemy who would refuse to play the game at all. And the Americans were not supposed to bring construction equipment to a battle. That violated every principle of military logic. Combat engineers, certainly. Every army had those. Men with demolition charges and Bangalore torpedoes, trained to destroy obstacles and clear paths. But those men fought as infantry. They bled. They died. They were accounted for in the calculations. Construction workers were something else entirely. They belonged in rear areas, far from gunfire, building the infrastructure that supported the fighting men. They were logistical assets, not combat assets. To land them on a contested beach was absurd. To land them with heavy machinery, bulldozers, cranes, graders, was beyond absurd. It was wasteful. It was American. Captain Masahiro Oba, who would survive the Saipan campaign and eventually surrender in December 1945, the last Japanese officer on the island to do so, later reflected on the assumptions that governed Japanese planning. We understood American wealth. We understood they had more ships, more planes, more bullets. We planned for this. What we did not understand was that they would use their wealth so strangely. We built fortifications to make them bleed. They brought machines to make our fortifications irrelevant. This was not in our manuals. This was not in our thinking. The Japanese had prepared for a siege. The Americans had brought an industrial revolution. The Seabees were born from catastrophe. On December 8, 1941, while smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Ben Moriel sat in his office at the Navy Department in Washington and confronted a problem that no American military planner had ever faced. The United States was now at war across 2 oceans, and it possessed almost no capacity to build the bases from which that war would be fought. The Navy's construction needs were handled by civilian contractors. This had worked adequately in peacetime. Companies like Contractors Pacific Naval Air Bases had built facilities across the Pacific using civilian workers recruited from American labor pools. But civilians presented an insurmountable problem in war. Under the Geneva Convention, non-military personnel who took up arms could be executed as unlawful combatants. Civilian workers could not defend themselves. They could not defend their equipment. They could only die or surrender. The reports flooding Moriel's desk in those first weeks made the consequences clear. On Wake Island, 1,200 civilian construction workers had been present when the Japanese attacked. They had watched, helpless, as their equipment was destroyed and their colleagues killed. Those who survived the initial assault became prisoners of war, or in 98 cases, victims of execution. On Guam, civilian workers had been captured within hours of the invasion. The infrastructure they had spent months building now served the enemy. Moriel, a civil engineer by training who had risen to become chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, understood that the Pacific War would be a war of construction. Every island taken would require airfields, fuel depots, ammunition storage, port facilities, roads, hospitals. The distances were too vast, the logistics too complex to fight without building, and building in a combat zone required men who could shoot back. "We need military personnel who can build," Moriel wrote in his proposal to the Secretary of the Navy on December 28, 1941. "And we need builders who can fight, not engineers who dabble in construction, not infantry who dabble in engineering. We need skilled tradesmen, the men who built America, in uniform, with weapons in their hands and the training to use them." The proposal was radical. Military tradition held that combat troops fought and support troops supported. The idea of arming construction workers struck many senior officers as absurd, even dangerous. Rear Admiral Randall Jacobs, Chief of Naval Personnel, questioned whether men recruited for their carpentry skills could be trusted with rifles. "You're asking me to militarize a labor union," he reportedly said. Moriel's response became legend within the organization he would create. "I'm asking you to give me the men who built the Golden Gate Bridge and the Hoover Dam, the men who laid railroads through the Rockies and drilled oil wells in Texas. You give me those men, and I will give you a force that builds what the Navy needs and kills anyone who tries to stop them." On January 5, 1942, the Bureau of Yards and Docks received authorization to recruit and train the first naval construction battalions. Moriel insisted on the term battalion specifically. It was a combat designation, not a labor designation. These would be military units, not work gangs. The recruitment criteria Moriel established broke every convention of military manpower. He wanted older men, experienced men, men whose hands already knew the tools. The minimum age was set at 18, but the average Seabee recruit in 1942 was 37 years old. Some were in their 50s and 60s. Chief Carpenter's mate, John O'Leary, who would serve with the 18th Naval Construction Battalion at Guadalcanal, was 63 years old and had been building bridges since the McKinley administration. These men brought skills that could not be taught in boot camp. They were welders who had joined steel on skyscrapers, electricians who had wired factories, heavy equipment operators who had moved mountains for the Tennessee Valley Authority, plumbers, pipe fitters, steel workers, masons, men who understood concrete curing times and load-bearing calculations, and the precise angle at which a drainage culvert must be laid. But Moriel also ensured they could kill. Seabee training at Camp Allen in Virginia and Camp Peary in Mississippi combined construction instruction with infantry combat tactics. The men learned to lay airstrips and dig fighting positions in the same week. They qualified with rifles, carbines, pistols, and the weapons that would become their signature, the machines themselves. "The Seabee does not abandon his equipment," read the training manual's final chapter. "His bulldozer is his rifle. His crane is his artillery. He will use every tool at his disposal to complete his mission and destroy the enemy." By December 1942, the first Seabee battalions had deployed to the Pacific. They arrived as construction workers. They would leave as something the Japanese had no word for. Guadalcanal broke them in. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion landed on the island in October 1942, 4 months into the most brutal campaign of the Pacific War. They came ashore at Lunga Point expecting to build. What they found was a nightmare of mud, malaria, and Japanese artillery that made no distinction between combat troops and construction crews. Within the first week, 17 Seabees were dead, not from building accidents, from combat. Japanese naval bombardment struck the construction areas with terrible regularity. The men of the 6th Battalion learned to sprint for foxholes at the sound of incoming shells, abandoning bulldozers mid-cut and cranes mid-lift. Equipment that took months to ship from the United States was destroyed in seconds. On the night of October 13th, the battleships Congo and Haruna shelled Henderson Field for 90 minutes. When dawn came, Chief Petty Officer Warren Grable walked the airstrip and counted the cost. 11 Seabees killed, 23 wounded, 4 bulldozers destroyed, 2 concrete mixers burning, and the runway, which they had spent 6 days building, cratered beyond recognition. They rebuilt it in 48 hours, then the Japanese shelled it again. The pattern was merciless. Build, destroy, rebuild, destroy. The Seabees filled craters while snipers fired from the tree line. They poured concrete while malaria burned through their ranks. They repaired aircraft revetments while Japanese destroyers lobbed shells from Iron Bottom Sound. The 6th Battalion lost 31 men killed and over 200 wounded or incapacitated by disease in their first 3 months on Guadalcanal. And the Japanese noticed. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Ito, an intelligence officer with the 17th Army, compiled reports on American construction activity throughout the campaign. His assessment, transmitted to Tokyo in November 1942, reflected the prevailing Japanese view. The American construction troops suffered disproportionate casualties due to their exposed positions and lack of combat discipline. They frequently abandon equipment during bombardment, suggesting poor morale and inadequate training. Their construction speed is impressive but unsustainable under continuous pressure. Recommendation: prioritize targeting of construction areas to degrade enemy logistics capability. Ito was not entirely wrong. The early Seabee battalions were learning lessons that no training manual had prepared them for. Equipment operators discovered that a bulldozer's engine noise masked the sound of incoming mortars. Welders learned that their torches created aiming points for snipers at night. Electricians found that stringing wire meant exposing themselves on elevated poles, silhouetted against the sky. The casualty rates reflected these hard lessons. In the first 18 months of the Pacific War, Seabee battalions suffered a killed-in-action rate nearly triple that of rear-echelon Navy personnel. The men who had volunteered to build were dying like infantry, but without the infantry's training in cover, concealment, and fire and maneuver tactics. Criticism came from all directions. Marine commanders questioned whether the Seabees were worth the resources they consumed. Colonel Merritt Edson, hero of Edson's Ridge, reportedly complained that the construction men attract shells like magnets and can't shoot back worth a damn. Army Air Forces officers grumbled about airstrip quality, comparing Seabee work unfavorably to the Corps of Engineers. Even within the Navy, some admirals wondered whether the experiment had failed. The men themselves felt it. Machinist's mate 2nd Class Robert Hendricks, who served with the 6th Battalion, wrote to his wife in December 1942, "The Marines look at us like we're in the way. Maybe we are. We came here to build them an airfield, and all we've done is get shelled and sick. Half the battalion's got malaria. The other half wishes they did, so they could get off this island. I don't know what we're supposed to be anymore." Japanese propaganda amplified the narrative of failure. Radio Tokyo broadcasts mocked the American builder soldiers as evidence of a nation too soft to produce real warriors. One broadcast, monitored by American intelligence in February 1943, featured a commentator laughing as he described the Seabees. "The Americans send old men with shovels to fight the Emperor's samurai. These grandfathers dig holes and die in them. This is the enemy we are supposed to fear?" The mockery reached its peak after the New Georgia campaign in mid-1943. The 24th and 73rd Naval Construction Battalions had been tasked with building an airfield at Munda Point, working under constant Japanese air attack and artillery harassment. Progress was agonizingly slow. Equipment broke down in the tropical humidity. Coral proved harder than anticipated. Japanese bombers struck the construction site on 14 consecutive nights. When the airfield finally became operational, weeks behind schedule, a Japanese reconnaissance plane photographed the results. The images, circulated among Imperial Army and Navy commands, showed a crude strip hacked from the jungle, pocked with poorly filled craters, its taxiways incomplete. Major Yoshiro Minamoto, an aviation staff officer at Rabaul, attached a note to the photographs. "The American construction troops build like children playing in sand. Their airfield will not survive the monsoon. Their machines are too delicate for this theater. Their men are too old for this war." The Seabees had been tested and found wanting, or so it appeared. What the Japanese could not see, what their reconnaissance planes could not photograph and their intelligence officers could not measure, was that the Seabees were learning. Every death taught a lesson. Every destroyed bulldozer revealed a vulnerability to be corrected. Every shelled airstrip demonstrated what needed to be built stronger, faster, differently. The old men with shovels were becoming something else, and they were bringing new tools to the next battle. June 17, 1944, Saipan, 2 days after the initial landings. Equipment Operator First Class Dale Gentry of the 121st Naval Construction Battalion had not slept in 36 hours. His Caterpillar D-7 bulldozer, serial number 4 T7823, a fact he would remember for the rest of his life, sat idling at the edge of a sugarcane field, while Marine infantry traded fire with a Japanese pillbox 70 yards ahead. The position had already killed 8 Marines. Its firing slit was barely visible, a dark rectangle cut into a mound of coral and reinforced concrete that naval bombardment had failed to crack. Every time the Marines advanced, the Nambu machine gun inside opened up, scything through the cane at knee height. The bodies lay where they had fallen, spread across the field in the postures of interrupted motion. Gentry watched a Marine lieutenant speaking into a field radio, calling for tank support. But the nearest Sherman was 400 yards back, bogged in a shell crater, and the Japanese had positioned the pillbox perfectly. Any vehicle approaching on the road would expose its thinner side armor to a second position on the ridge above. The lieutenant threw down the radio handset in frustration. Then he looked at Gentry's bulldozer. "Can that thing take a bullet?" Gentry had been asking himself the same question. The D-7 was not armored. Its engine block might stop small arms fire, but the operator's seat was open to the air. He would be completely exposed. But the blade. The blade was 3 inches of hardened steel, 8 feet wide, designed to move mountains. "It can take more than a bullet," Gentry said. What happened next would be recounted in after-action reports, documented in official Seabees histories, and remembered by every Marine who witnessed it. Gentry dropped the blade to its lowest position, angling it slightly upward to protect the engine compartment. Then he pushed the throttle forward and drove directly at the pillbox. The Nambu opened fire immediately. Rounds sparked off the blade in a continuous spray of ricochets. Gentry could hear them, a sound like hail on a tin roof, if hail were supersonic and trying to kill you. He kept his head below the blade's upper edge, steering blind, feeling the ground through the machine's vibrations. The D-7 crushed sugarcane beneath its tracks, lurching over bodies he tried not to think about. 30 yards, 20. The machine gun fire intensified. Something punched through the side panel above his right knee. Later, he would find it had missed his femoral artery by 2 inches. He did not stop. The blade struck the pillbox with a sound Gentry would describe in a 1987 interview as like hitting a tree stump the size of a house. The D-7's tracks spun, bit, caught. The engine roared, and slowly, impossibly, the mound of coral and concrete began to move, not collapse, move. Gentry was pushing the entire structure backward, his blade buried in its face, tons of fortifications sliding across the ground like furniture across a floor. Then he changed tactics. Instead of pushing, Gentry raised the blade and drove up onto the pillbox itself. The D-7 climbed the mound, its tracks churning coral into powder. When he reached the top, he spun the machine in place, blade down, and began to dig. The Marines watching from the sugarcane field realized what he was doing before the Japanese inside did. He was burying them, the blade cut into the coral and sand, piling it against the structure's sides, over its roof, across its firing slit. Each pass added another foot of debris. The machine gun fell silent. Whether from damage or from the simple fact that the barrel was now packed with coral, no one would ever know. Gentry kept digging. He worked the D-7 back and forth across the pillbox like a man smoothing cement, packing the debris tighter with each pass. It took 4 minutes. When he finally backed the bulldozer off the mound, there was no pillbox visible, only a flattened pile of coral and sand, perhaps 8 feet high, with no entrance, no exit, no firing slit, no way in, no way out. Sergeant Major Takeo Yamaguchi, observing from a secondary position 200 meters east, watched through binoculars as the American machine completed its work. He had seen men die in every way the Pacific War offered. He had seen friends burned alive by flamethrowers, torn apart by naval shells, drowned in flooded tunnels. But he had never seen men buried alive by a piece of construction equipment. He could hear them, the men inside the pillbox, his men, soldiers of the 136th Infantry Regiment, were screaming. The sound was faint, muffled by tons of debris, but unmistakable. They were scratching at the walls, pounding. The coral was too thick to break through. The air inside would last perhaps 20 minutes. Yamaguchi lowered his binoculars. His hands were shaking. "What is that machine?" asked the private beside him. Yamaguchi did not answer. He was watching the American operator climb down from the bulldozer, inspect the bullet hole above his knee as if it were a minor inconvenience, and then climb back into the seat. The machine rumbled forward toward the next position on the ridge. The screaming from beneath the coral continued for another 11 minutes. Then it stopped. Lieutenant Commander Nakagawa received the report that evening. A single enemy construction vehicle had neutralized a fortified position that had resisted 2 days of infantry assault and naval bombardment. 63 men entombed, 0 American casualties in the final action. He read the report twice, certain there had been a transcription error. There had not been. The laborers had stopped building. They had started burying. The word spread through Japanese positions across Saipan like a virus. The Americans had weaponized their construction equipment. Within a week of Dale Gentry's assault, Seabee bulldozer tactics had evolved from improvisation into doctrine. The 121st Battalion alone entombed 17 pillboxes in the first 10 days of the campaign. The 18th Battalion, operating in the northern sector, developed a technique they called capping, using bulldozers to pile debris over cave mouths while infantry provided suppressing fire. The 133rd Battalion modified their D7s with improvised armor plating stripped from destroyed Japanese tanks, creating machines that could absorb rifle and machine gun fire indefinitely. The mathematics of Japanese defensive doctrine: 147 shells per pillbox, 15 American casualties per position, collapsed overnight. A fortification that should have held for days, bleeding the Marines white, now lasted hours, sometimes minutes. The bulldozers did not need to destroy the positions. They did not need to breach them. They simply erased them from the landscape, transforming elaborate defensive works into unmarked graves. Captain Sakai Oba, commanding the remnants of the 18th Infantry Regiment in Saipan's interior, recorded the psychological impact in his field journal on June 24, 1944. The men no longer trust the bunkers. They see what happens. They hear the stories. A position that took 3 months to construct, buried in 4 minutes. The men inside had no chance to fight, no chance to die with honor. They simply disappeared. Some of my soldiers now refuse to enter fortifications at all. They prefer to die in the open, where at least they can see what kills them. The preference for death in the open was not metaphor. Japanese soldiers began abandoning prepared positions when they heard the distinctive rumble of Caterpillar diesels approaching. They emerged from bunkers and tunnels to fight and die as infantry in the open, surrendering every advantage their engineers had spent months constructing. The fortifications that were supposed to multiply Japanese combat power instead became psychological liabilities. On Tinian, the pattern accelerated. The 18th, 121st, and 133rd Seabee battalions landed on July 24, 1944, less than 6 weeks after the Saipan invasion began. They brought 57 bulldozers. The Japanese garrison, 8,500 men under Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata, had constructed over 400 fortified positions across the island's 39 square miles. The island fell in 9 days. Marine after-action reports credited the speed of the Tinian campaign to multiple factors: superior naval gunfire, effective close air support, the shock of the Japanese defeat on Saipan. But the reports also noted something unprecedented: the systematic neutralization of fortified positions by construction equipment. Seabee operators on Tinian refined their tactics to industrial precision. They worked in pairs, one bulldozer approaching from the front to draw fire, while the second circled to attack from the flank. They developed signals with Marine infantry, coordinating assaults so that the moment a bulldozer sealed a position, riflemen were already moving to the next objective. They learned which positions could be buried and which required a different approach. Some bunkers were simply pushed off cliffs, their occupants tumbling into the sea inside concrete coffins. Private First Class Shigeru Mizuki, a Japanese soldier who survived Tinian by hiding in a sugarcane field for 3 weeks, described the experience in a post-war memoir. The sound of the American machines was constant, day and night. You could hear them working, not the sound of construction, but the sound of destruction, grinding, crushing. And sometimes, beneath the engine noise, screaming. Everyone heard it. No one spoke of it. The screaming became a psychological weapon in itself. Marine infantry reported that Japanese soldiers in adjacent positions could hear their comrades being buried alive. The effect was devastating. Men who had sworn to die for the emperor broke and ran rather than wait for the bulldozers to reach them. Others committed suicide preemptively, preferring a bullet to suffocation. A few, a very few, attempted to surrender, though the chaos of combat meant many were shot before their intentions became clear. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakagawa did not survive to see the fall of Saipan. He died on July 7, 1944, during the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War, when 4,000 Japanese soldiers made a final desperate assault on American lines. His body was never identified, but his aide, Lieutenant Endo, survived long enough to record a final entry in the command diary. We trained to hold. We built positions that should have lasted months. The Americans brought machines that turned our bunkers into tombs. We prepared for a battle of attrition. They brought a battle of burial. There is no tactic to counter this. There is no courage that can stop a bulldozer. We can only die, and they do not even allow us to choose how. On Iwo Jima, the Seabees faced their greatest test and delivered their most devastating performance. The island was a fortress unlike anything the Pacific had seen. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months transforming Iwo Jima's volcanic rock into an underground labyrinth. 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 caves and bunkers, positions buried so deep that naval bombardment could not reach them. Kuribayashi had studied the American victories at Saipan and Tinian. He knew about the bulldozers. He believed he had found the counter. "The Americans cannot bury what is already buried," he wrote to his wife in January 1945. "Our positions are carved from the mountain itself. Their machines are useless against living rock." He was half right. The 31st, 62nd, and 133rd Seabee battalions landed on Iwo Jima beginning February 19, 1945. They brought 63 bulldozers, 18 of them fitted with the new armored cab kits developed after Saipan. They could not bury Kuribayashi's tunnels, but they could seal them. The volcanic terrain that protected Japanese positions also limited their entrances and exits. Each tunnel system had ventilation shafts, observation ports, firing slits, openings that allowed air and visibility, but also provided targets. Seabee operators learned to identify these openings and close them systematically, piling volcanic sand and debris until the tunnels became airtight tombs. The Japanese inside faced an impossible choice: emerge and fight, or suffocate in the dark. Most chose to fight. They boiled out of sealed tunnels in desperate counterattacks, often at night, trying to reach the bulldozers before they could complete their work. The Seabees learned to expect this. They welded pipe frames to their machines and hung demolition charges from the frames, improvised explosive protection that detonated when Japanese soldiers attempted to climb aboard. They mounted .30 caliber machine guns on bulldozer cabs, turning construction equipment into assault vehicles. Chief Equipment Operator Harold "Pappy" Crabtree of the 133rd Battalion sealed 14 cave positions during the Battle for Hill 382, working for 72 consecutive hours, with only brief pauses to refuel his machine. On the third night, a Japanese soldier managed to climb onto his bulldozer with a satchel charge. Crabtree shot him with a pistol, kicked the body and the unexploded charge off his machine, and continued working. He was 51 years old. When asked after the war why he hadn't stopped, Crabtree's answer became famous among Seabee veterans. "Stop for what? The job wasn't done. Those boys in the caves weren't going to bury themselves." They weren't. But by the time Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945, Seabee bulldozers had sealed over 300 Japanese positions. The exact number of men entombed was never determined. The bodies were never recovered. They remained there still, beneath the black sand and volcanic rock, in tunnels that were meant to protect them, and became instead their graves. The builders had become grave diggers on an industrial scale. The numbers tell a story that requires no embellishment. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States Navy deployed 325,000 Seabees across the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. They constructed 111 major airstrips, 441 piers, 2,558 ammunition magazines, 700 square blocks of warehouses, hospitals for 70,000 beds, tanks for the storage of 100 million gallons of fuel, and housing for 1.5 million men. They built bases on islands that had never known permanent human settlement, transformed volcanic rocks into unsinkable aircraft carriers, and laid more concrete in 3 years than the Roman Empire poured in 3 centuries. But those were the construction statistics. The combat statistics told a different story. Seabee units were credited with the direct neutralization of over 1,200 fortified Japanese positions across the Pacific Theater. Bulldozers alone, not counting demolitions, not counting infantry support, not counting the positions abandoned in panic at the sound of approaching engines, entombed an estimated 8,000 to 12,000 Japanese soldiers. The true number will never be known. Many of those positions were never excavated. The bodies were never counted. The Seabees lost 272 men killed in action and over 500 wounded. They earned 33 Silver Stars, 5 Navy Crosses, and uncounted Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. They were the only construction force in modern military history to be awarded combat decorations as a matter of routine. And when the war ended, the survivors of the Japanese military were finally able to speak about what they had witnessed. Colonel Takechi Nishi, the famous Olympic equestrian who died commanding a tank unit on Iwo Jima, left no testimony, but his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Fujita Haruo, survived the battle as a prisoner and was interrogated extensively at Pearl Harbor in April 1945. The transcript, declassified in 1978, contains a remarkable passage. Interrogator: were there any American weapons or tactics that your forces found particularly difficult to counter? Fujita: the bulldozers. Long pause. I know this sounds strange. A bulldozer is not a weapon. But on Iwo Jima, the bulldozers killed more of our men than the tanks. We could stop tanks. We had guns that could penetrate their armor. We had mines. We had soldiers willing to throw themselves beneath the treads with explosives. But the bulldozers, they did not fight. They simply erased us. They filled our caves with sand while we were still inside. They pushed our bunkers into the sea. We had no doctrine for fighting a machine that did not fight back. It only buried. The interrogator noted that Fujita paused frequently during this portion of the interview and appeared to be struggling with emotion. Similar testimony emerged across the Pacific. Sergeant Major Takeo Yamaguchi, who had watched Dale Gentry bury his comrades on Saipan, surrendered on August 15, 1945, the day of the Emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's capitulation. He spent 2 years in an American prisoner of war camp in the Philippines before repatriation. In 1962, he published a memoir titled The Grave Builders, which became controversial in Japan for its unflinching description of American tactics and Japanese failure. We called them Tsuchi no Akuma, demons of earth, Yamaguchi wrote. They were not soldiers in any sense we understood. They were older than our soldiers, often fat, rarely graceful with their weapons. We laughed at them when we first saw them building roads under fire. We stopped laughing on Saipan. A soldier can face another soldier. He can face a tank, a plane, artillery. These are enemies he has been trained to fight. But how does one face a machine that turns the earth itself against you? Our bunkers were built to protect us. The Americans made them into coffins. This was not warfare. This was something else, something we had no name for. The memoir's most devastating passage described the aftermath of a bulldozer attack on a command bunker near Mount Tapochau. I found the position 3 days later when our counterattack briefly recaptured that sector. The bunker was gone. In its place was a mound of coral and sand, perhaps 3 meters high, with no indication that a fortification had ever existed there. I knew 42 men had been inside. I could see no trace of them, no bodies, no equipment, no flag. It was as if they had never existed. The Americans had not merely killed them, they had unmade them. They had removed them from the earth as completely as if they had never been born. Captain Sakai Oba, whose field journal had documented the psychological collapse of Japanese defensive confidence on Saipan, became something of a legend. He refused to surrender until December 1st, 1945, nearly 4 months after the war's official end. Emerging from the jungle with 46 soldiers, the last organized Japanese resistance on the island, American journalists called him the Fox of Saipan. In a 1971 interview with a Japanese television network, Oba was asked what he remembered most vividly about the battle. "The sound," he said immediately. "Not the explosions, not the gunfire. The sound of the American machines. They worked day and night, building roads, airfields, hospitals, and burying our men. The same machines did both. In the morning, a bulldozer would be grading a road. In the afternoon, it would be sealing a cave with 50 soldiers inside. And then it would return to grading the road. As if burying men alive was simply another task, another job to complete before dinner. This was the most terrifying thing about the Americans. Not their cruelty. They were not cruel. They were efficient. Killing us was simply part of the work." The interview footage shows Oba falling silent for nearly 10 seconds before continuing. "We believed we understood American weakness, their softness, their love of comfort. We thought construction workers would be helpless in combat. We thought their machines were tools, not weapons. We were wrong about everything. The construction workers were killers. The machines were instruments of death. And the Americans, we thought, were soft-buried our hardest men in their own fortifications without breaking a sweat." Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from an anonymous source, a Japanese veteran interviewed by American historian John Toland in 1969 during research for his book, The Rising Sun. The veteran, who refused to give his name, had served on Peleliu and witnessed Seabee operations during that nightmarish battle. "You want to know about the bulldozers," the veteran said. "Everyone wants to know. They were yellow, bright yellow. This is what I remember most. In the jungle, among the burned trees and the gray coral and the black smoke, these bright yellow machines moving through our positions. They looked like toys, children's toys, and they killed us by the hundreds. I still dream about them. Not the Marines, not the aircraft, the yellow machines. In my dreams, I am in a cave, and I hear the engine getting closer, and I know the sand is about to pour through the entrance, and I cannot move. I wake up unable to breathe." Toland noted that the veteran's hands shook throughout the interview. "I do not hate the Americans," the man concluded. "War is war. Men die. But I will never forgive them for making me fear a bulldozer. A bulldozer. This is not a death for a soldier. This is not a death for anyone." The Seabees had done more than win battles. They had broken something in the men who faced them. On the morning of June 15, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakagawa had watched American construction workers wade ashore on Saipan and permitted himself a thin smile. "The Americans have brought their dokata," he had said, "their laborers, their ditch diggers, men who would make excellent prisoners because they knew how to work." He gave them one night to live. 22 days later, Nakagawa was dead. One of 29,000 Japanese soldiers who perished on Saipan, many of them buried in the fortifications that were supposed to make them invincible. The laborers he dismissed had outlived him. The machines he ignored had entombed his men. The construction workers he mocked had helped break the spine of Japanese defensive doctrine across the Pacific. The Dokata had won. Lieutenant Endo's prediction proved equally hollow. The Seabees did not become prisoners. They did not learn to work for the Emperor. Instead, they taught the Emperor's finest soldiers what it meant to face an enemy who refused to play by the rules, who brought industrial machinery to a fortress battle and turned concrete bunkers into mass graves. The Seabees changed warfare in ways that military theorists are still studying. They proved that the line between combat and construction was artificial, a relic of thinking that separated warriors from workers as if they were different species. They demonstrated that American industrial capacity was not merely a logistical advantage, but a weapon system in itself, that the nation which built the Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge could build its enemies' tombs with the same efficiency. After the war, the Japanese military conducted extensive studies of their defeat. The analyses filled thousands of pages. They examined American air power, naval superiority, logistical abundance, intelligence capabilities, but buried in the technical assessments were passages that revealed a deeper bewilderment, a failure to comprehend an enemy who had violated every assumption about how wars were fought. A 1946 report from the Japanese Defense Agency's historical section contained this observation. The American Seabees represented a concept of warfare that had no parallel in Japanese military thinking. They were simultaneously builders and destroyers, laborers and killers. They used the tools of peace as weapons of war. We had no category for such men. We had no defense against such tactics. We had assumed that construction workers would avoid combat. Instead, they sought it out, and when they found it, they buried us alive. The report concluded with a single sentence that might serve as the Seabees' epitaph. We prepared our fortifications to make the Americans bleed. They brought machines that made our fortifications into coffins. This was not a failure of courage or planning. This was a failure of imagination. We could not imagine such men existed, but they did exist. They were welders from Pittsburgh and equipment operators from Texas and electricians from California. They were men too old for the draft who volunteered anyway. They were grandfathers who learned to kill with bulldozers because that was what the job required. They built airfields under fire and hospitals under bombardment and roads through jungles that had never known a wheel. And when the enemy laughed at them, called them laborers, dismissed them as soft, predicted they would not survive the first night, they answered with the only response that mattered. They buried the laughter under 10,000 tons of coral and sand. The Seabees' motto, chosen by Rear Admiral Ben Moriel in 1942, was Construimus Batuimus, we build, we fight. By 1945, the Japanese had learned to translate it differently. We build, we bury. And in the silence beneath the black sands of Iwo Jima, beneath the coral of Saipan and Tinian and Peleliu, in tunnels that were meant to last 1,000 years and became instead eternal tombs, the Emperor's soldiers learned the truth that Lieutenant Commander Nakagawa never lived to understand. The most dangerous men in the American military were the ones who came to build.